Rain had not stopped in 11 days. It fell without drama, without thunder or spectacle, just a constant whispering drizzle that seeped into the walls of Whitmore Manor and settled there like a second skin. The house smelled of damp plaster and old wood and something else, something harder to name. Resignation, perhaps. The slow, patient smell of a place that had stopped expecting better. Rosalind Whitmore knew every leak. She knew the one above the east corridor that dripped in a steady, almost musical rhythm onto the copper basin she had placed there 3 winters ago. She knew the one in the servants' passage that only appeared when the wind came from the north. She knew the dark stain spreading across the ceiling of the blue parlor, a map of their ruin drawn in watermarks, growing larger with each passing season. At 24, she had become fluent in the language of decay. She could read a crack in a wall the way other women read poetry. She understood load-bearing beams and rotting joinery and the precise cost of replacing a single pane of glass in a window that hadn't been opened in years. These were not accomplishments that would impress anyone at a London assembly, but they were hers, and they were real. That morning, she was in the kitchen garden, her boots sunk in mud, her plainest brown dress darkened at the hem with rainwater. She was harvesting the last of the winter cabbages, her bare hands reddened by the cold. The kitchen maid had left the previous month, unable to wait any longer for wages that were not coming. The cook had stayed, out of loyalty or stubbornness, or perhaps simply because she had nowhere else to go. But the garden was Rosalind's domain. It had been since she was 16, since the last groundskeeper had been let go and her father had waved his hand vaguely and said someone ought to see to the vegetables. She heard the front bell from across the yard. It was a rusted, reluctant sound, as if the bell itself was embarrassed to announce visitors to such a diminished house. She straightened, pushing a strand of dark hair from her face with the back of her wrist, and watched through the kitchen gate as a carriage rolled up the drive. It was not a grand carriage. It was black, understated, perfectly maintained. But the horses were extraordinary. 2 matched bays with coats like burnished copper, moving with the easy, muscular grace of animals that had never known a poor stable. They were worth more than everything Whitmore Manor contained, and Rosalind knew it instantly. She did not go to the front door. She went to the kitchen, washed her hands in the basin, dried them on a cloth, and stood very still for a moment, listening. She could hear her father's voice, high and anxious, echoing through the hall. She could hear a second voice, lower, quieter, saying very little. Her father found her 10 minutes later. Sir Gilbert Whitmore was 53 but looked older, his face lined and pouched, his eyes carrying the particular glaze of a man who had been frightened for so long that fear had become his resting state. Rosalind. "There you are. Come to the study. We have a visitor. Who is he?" Her father hesitated. His fingers were working at the button of his waistcoat, twisting it back and forth. "A Mr. Thorne, a man of business from London. He has an interest in the property." The word property struck her like a slap, though she did not show it. Whitmore Manor was not a property. It was the place where her mother had planted roses along the south wall. It was the place where she had learned to read, curled in the window seat of the library while rain streamed down the glass. It was falling apart, yes, but it was theirs. Or it had been. "I see," she said. "Give me a moment to change." "No time. He is waiting. Just come as you are." She looked down at her brown dress, mud-stained and shapeless. Her hands were still rough from the garden, her hair loosely pinned and damp at the temples. She was not dressed to receive anyone. She was dressed to dig turnips. She went anyway. The man standing in her father's study was tall and lean, with dark hair cut close and a face that seemed designed for severity. High cheekbones, a firm jaw, a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to curve upward. He was dressed in dark wool, impeccably tailored, but without ostentation. No watch chain, no rings, no unnecessary ornament of any kind. He stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the overgrown grounds with an expression she could not read. He turned when she entered. His eyes were green, not the pale, watery green of shallow water, but a deep, steady green like moss on old stone. They moved over her once, quickly, taking in the muddy hem, the work-roughened hands, the loose hair. He did not react. He simply looked, the way a man looks at a landscape he is trying to understand. "My daughter, Rosalind," Sir Gilbert said, gesturing. "Rosalind, Mr. Thorne, Miss Whitmore." He inclined his head. His voice was low, unadorned, precise. "Mr. Thorne." She did not curtsy. She was wearing mud on her boots and cabbage leaves on her sleeve, and a curtsy would have made the whole scene absurd. She simply met his gaze and held it. Something shifted in his expression. A flicker, barely perceptible, like a candle flame disturbed by a draught. Then it was gone. The dinner that followed was a small catastrophe of pretension. Her father had instructed the cook to produce their best, which amounted to a thin soup, a joint of mutton that had seen better days, and a bread pudding made with stale loaves. The dining room was cold, the candles guttered in the draught from the windows. Sir Gilbert talked without pause, a desperate monologue about the history of the manor, the quality of the land, the promising harvest that never quite arrived. Mr. Thorne ate in silence. He did not complain. He did not compliment. He consumed the indifferent food with the same focused attention he seemed to bring to everything, as if the meal were a document he was reading for content rather than pleasure. He spoke to Rosalind once. She had been watching him watch the room, noting the way his gaze catalogued every deficiency, every sign of neglect, and she had felt a slow burn of something that was not quite anger and not quite shame. "The vegetable garden," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through her father's nervous chatter. "You tend it yourself." It was not a question. "I do." The soil looked well managed. "You rotate your crops, turnips and cabbages in winter, beans and peas in spring to fix the nitrogen, potatoes in the south beds where the drainage is best." He regarded her for a moment. "You've read Tull and Young and Coke of Holcomb's pamphlets. Most women of your station would not trouble themselves with agricultural theory. Most women of my station have gardeners." The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before. It was not empty. It was full of something she could not name. He looked at her across the table, and she had the disorienting sense that he was seeing her clearly, the way she saw a cracked wall or a leaking roof, honestly, without sentiment, acknowledging what was broken and what was sound. After dinner she left the men and went to the library. It was the only room in the house that still felt like itself, the shelves sagging under the weight of books that no creditor would bother to claim, the old leather chairs worn to the shape of the bodies that had sat in them for decades. She did not light a candle. She stood in the dark, her forehead pressed against the cold glass of the window, and waited. Her father came to her an hour later. He looked hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside him and removed something essential. "His name is not Thorne," he said. She turned from the window. "He is Edmund Hale, the Marquess of Thornfield." The name meant nothing to her for a moment, and then it meant everything. Thornfield, one of the oldest titles in England, estates in 3 counties, a fortune that was spoken of in hushed, almost reverential tones even among the wealthy. "Why?" she whispered. Her father sat down heavily. The chair groaned beneath him. "He requires a wife." Quietly, without the circus of the season. "He wants someone of good family who will not bring complications, someone practical." Rosalind felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She understood. She understood with a clarity that was almost cruel. She was the practical choice, the desperate girl from the ruined estate who would not have the luxury of refusal. "He will settle every debt," her father said, his voice cracking. "Every last one. He will secure an income for me. He will see the manor maintained. He paused. He requires an answer by morning. She stood very still. The rain whispered against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked, and the old timbers shifted inside. "Tell his lordship," she said, "that I will speak with him before breakfast. I have conditions." She did not sleep. She sat in the window seat of her bedroom, wrapped in a shawl that had belonged to her mother, and watched the rain fall on the dark gardens below. She thought about what it meant to sell yourself, and whether it was still selling if you set the price. At 7 o'clock she went downstairs. He was already in the library, standing exactly where she had stood the night before, as if he had claimed the spot by right of superior will. The morning light was grey and thin, and it made his face look carved from something harder than flesh. Miss Whitmore. He turned. He was already dressed, as if he'd been awake for hours. Perhaps he had been awake for hours. Perhaps he had. "My lord, my father has told me who you are." "And you are not surprised?" "I am not. Wealthy men do not visit failing estates for the pleasure of bad mutton." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The ghost of one. "I accept your proposal," she said, "with 2 conditions." He waited. "First, my father's debts are to be paid, but he is not to be given free access to money. A fixed quarterly allowance, managed by your steward. He is a good man, but he is not capable of financial restraint. I will not watch him ruin himself again." A pause. A single nod. Agreed. Second. She took a breath. This was the one that mattered. "I will be your wife in every sense. I will fulfill every duty the role requires. But I will not be ornamental. I will manage your households. I will have a voice in the running of your estates. I will be your partner in this arrangement, not a portrait on your wall." The silence stretched. She could hear the rain, the tick of a clock in the hall, the sound of her own blood in her ears. "You are aware," he said slowly, "that you are in no position to negotiate. I am aware that you traveled 2 days to find a wife in a house with a leaking roof. You did not come here for beauty or fortune. You came here because you wanted someone who would not waste your time. I am telling you I will not." He studied her. The green eyes were unreadable, but she thought, she hoped, that there was something like respect in them. "Very well, Miss Whitmore. We have an agreement." He held out his hand. Not gallantly, not romantically. The way one seals a contract. She took it. His grip was firm and cool and brief. The wedding was 3 days later in the parish church. She wore her best dress, the dark blue wool, because it was the only garment she owned that did not have a mended seam or a frayed hem. The vicar looked bewildered. Her father wept. Edmund stood beside her like a man fulfilling a military obligation, his face composed, his responses precise. Afterward, there was no celebration. She packed her belongings into a single trunk, kissed her father's damp cheek, and climbed into the carriage. She did not look back at Whitmore Manor. She had spent years holding it together. Now it was time to let it hold itself. Thornfield Park was a shock. Not because it was large, though it was enormous. A sprawling Palladian house of honey-colored stone set in 1,000 acres of rolling Wiltshire parkland. The shock was the silence. Whitmore Manor had been silent too, but its silence was the silence of exhaustion, of things wearing out. Thornfield's silence was different. It was the silence of a machine running perfectly with no one watching. Every surface gleamed. Every hedge was trimmed to mathematical precision. The servants moved through the corridors like ghosts, efficient and invisible. She was received by the butler, a man named Aldridge, whose face appeared to have been ironed along with his shirt, and the housekeeper, a formidable woman called Mrs. York. Fenwick, who looked at Rosalind's single trunk and worn blue dress with an expression that managed to be both perfectly polite and deeply skeptical. Edmund disappeared into his study. She did not see him again that day, or the next. or the one after that. She was given a suite of rooms in the West Wing that were beautiful and impersonal, like rooms in a museum. She ate alone. She walked the corridors alone. She explored the grounds alone, discovering formal gardens maintained with ruthless perfection. Every rose pruned, every gravel path raked, every blade of grass standing at attention. It was immaculate. It was lifeless. On the fourth day, she found the library. It occupied the entire east wing of the ground floor. 2 stories of books reaching up to a vaulted ceiling painted with faded mythological scenes. The collection was extraordinary. Thousands of volumes in leather and cloth and vellum, organized with the same fanatical precision that governed everything at Thornfield. She ran her fingers along the spines, pulling out titles at random. History, natural philosophy, poetry, estate management, botany. Generations of Hale minds, preserved in ink and paper. She was deep in a treatise on landscape design when she became aware that she was being watched. He was standing in the doorway, his shoulder against the frame, his arms crossed. She did not know how long he had been there. "You found Repton," he said. She closed the book. "Your great-grandfather commissioned him to redesign the grounds, it seems." He did. The south garden was his design. "It's technically perfect," she said. Then, before she could stop herself, "It has no soul." His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "This entire house," she continued, because she had started, and there was no point in retreating now, "is like a clock. Every gear in place, every mechanism polished, every hand pointing precisely where it should. But a clock is not a home. A home should feel like someone lives in it." He was quiet for a long time. She braced herself. "No one has lived in this house," he said finally, his voice barely audible, "for a very long time." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the vast, perfect silence. A week later, Rosalind asked Mrs. Fenwick to replace the long mahogany dining table with a smaller round one from the morning room. Mrs. Fenwick's left eyebrow rose approximately 1/16 of an inch. She consulted his lordship. To her visible astonishment, he approved. That evening, they sat across from each other at the small table, close enough that the candlelight caught both their faces. A jar of snowdrops from the conservatory stood between them. Rosalind had placed it there herself. "You are changing my house," Edmund said. "I am making it ours," she corrected gently. He looked at the snowdrops. He looked at her. And for the first time since she had known him, the severity in his face softened into something almost human. "Tell me about the crop rotation," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. At Whitmore, you described a system. Turnips, beans, potatoes. I want to understand it." She began to speak, cautiously at first, then with growing warmth. She talked about soil, about the patient chemistry of nitrogen and phosphorus, about watching a seed become a plant and a plant become food on a table. She talked about the satisfaction of growing something with her own hands, of understanding the land not as an abstraction on a ledger, but as a living thing that responded to attention and care. He listened, not politely, not patiently, but with genuine attention, leaning forward slightly, his green eyes intent on her face. When she finished, the candles had burned low and the snowdrops were glowing white in the dimness. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who would accept her situation quietly and ask for nothing." "I did accept it quietly. I simply also ask for something." That ghost of a smile appeared again, and this time it lingered a fraction of a second longer. The arrival of his grandmother changed everything. Lady Dorothea Hale, Dowager Marchioness of Thornfield, was 76 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and possessed a personality roughly the size of Westminster Abbey. She descended upon Thornfield in a coach piled high with hat boxes and opinions. "So," she said, examining Rosalind with bright, fierce eyes, "you're the girl Edmund found in a turnip field. Show me your hands." Rosalind, startled, held them out. Lady Dorothea inspected them. Good. Working hands. I cannot abide a woman whose hands have never done anything useful. Now tell me honestly, is my grandson still behaving like a marble statue, or has he thawed slightly? Slightly, Rosalind admitted. Progress. Now come with me. We have work to do. Lady Dorothea swept through Thornfield like a benevolent hurricane. She inspected the kitchens, tasted the bread, interrogated Mrs. Fenwick about the household accounts, and declared the drawing-room curtains a national disgrace. She knew every servant by name. She asked after their children, their ailments, their opinions on the weather. In her wake, the house seemed to exhale, to loosen, as if it had been holding its breath for years. A house needs warmth, she told Rosalind. Not just fires in the grates. Human warmth, conversation, laughter, the smell of bread baking, flowers on a table. Edmund has been running this place like a barracks since his parents died. He has forgotten that a house is supposed to be lived in. She also, with ruthless efficiency, addressed the matter of Rosalind's wardrobe. My dear, you dress like a governess in mourning. We are going to London. London was a revelation and an ordeal. Thornfield House in Grosvenor Square made the country estate look intimate. The season was in full roar, and the news of the Marquess's sudden, mysterious marriage had set the drawing-rooms of Mayfair ablaze with speculation. Under Lady Dorothea's guidance, Rosalind was outfitted by the finest modesty in Bond Street. She chose silks and muslins in colors she had never been able to afford. Deep forest green, warm ivory, slate blue, and one gown of pale gold that caught the light like early morning sun on still water. She refused anything fussy or overwrought. The fabrics were rich. The cuts were clean. The effect was quiet and striking. Edmund saw her in the gold gown on the evening of their first ball. She came down the staircase and he stopped mid-sentence. Whatever he had been saying to Aldridge dying on his lips, he simply looked at her. "You look beautiful," he said. It sounded like the words had been pulled from him against his will. "Thank you, Edmund." It was the first time she'd used his name without his title, and the sound of it in her voice changed the air between them. The ball was at the Countess of Waverley's. The ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, the air heavy with hothouse flowers and perfume. As the Marquess and Marchioness of Thornfield were announced, the crowd turned as one, a ripple of whispers spreading outward like rings on a pond. Lady Isabel Crane found them within the hour. She was dazzling, dark-haired and violet-eyed, draped in sapphire silk and diamonds. She had been the acknowledged front-runner in the race for Edmund Hale's hand, and his marriage to an unknown country. Nobody was a wound she had no intention of allowing to heal. "Lord Thornfield," she said, her voice silken. "How delightful to see you in society at last. And this must be your little wife. What a charming dress, so refreshingly simple." The word simple was a dagger wrapped in velvet. "Lady Isabel," Rosalind replied, her voice steady and warm. "How kind. I find simplicity so much more restful than effort, don't you? One can always tell when someone is trying too hard." Isabel's smile froze. She had expected a stammering mouse. She had gotten a cat with quiet claws. Edmund's hand settled at the small of Rosalind's back. A small gesture, a declaration. In the weeks that followed, Isabel waged her campaign. The weapons were familiar ones: whispered rumors, social snubs, invitations that went astray, pointed silences when Rosalind entered a room. The story she planted was elegant in its cruelty, that Sir Gilbert Whitmore had not merely been unfortunate, but dishonest. That the marriage was not a love match, but a cover-up, the Marquess purchasing silence with a wedding ring. Rosalind bore it. She did not complain. She did not retaliate. She continued to attend events, to speak with intelligence and warmth to those who would listen, to stand beside her husband with a dignity that made the rumors seem small and mean. She found allies, quietly, among the women who valued substance over spectacle. But she felt it, the cold shoulders, the averted eyes, the conversations that stopped when she approached. Each one was a small wound, and they accumulated. Edmund watched. He had always watched, but now his attention had a different quality. It was not analytical. It was protective. He found himself tracking her across crowded rooms, his evening unsettled until he located her. He found himself staying longer at dinner, drawing her into conversations about books and gardens and the philosophy of land management. He found himself thinking about the way she had stood in his library in her muddy dress and told him his house had no soul. He was falling in love with his wife, and the realization terrified him. One night, late, he was working in his study when the door opened. Rosalind stood there in her dressing gown, her dark hair loose over her shoulders, carrying a cup of tea. "I thought you might need this," she said simply, and set it on his desk. He looked up at her, in the lamplight, with her hair down and her face unguarded. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Not the sharp, calculated beauty of Isobel Crane. A beauty that was about warmth and realness and the quiet courage of a woman who had never once asked for pity. "Stay," he said. The word came out rougher than he intended. She looked at him, surprised. "Just stay. For a moment." She sat in the chair across from his desk, tucking her feet beneath her. Neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. The silence was not empty. It was full, a room crowded with everything they had not yet said to each other. "Rosalind," he said finally. "Yes?" He shook his head. "Nothing. Only your name." She smiled. It was small and real, and it broke something open inside him that he had kept sealed shut for years. The crisis came at a dinner hosted by Lord and Lady Pemberton. Isabel, sensing that her campaign was faltering, that the Tun's attention was beginning to drift, launched her final assault. She stood in a circle of allies and spoke, in a voice pitched precisely to Carrie, about the unfortunate Whitmore family, about debts and dishonor, about a marchioness who was nothing more than a purchased commodity. Rosalind, standing 10 feet away with a glass of champagne she was not drinking, heard every word. Edmund heard them too. He had been speaking with a colleague from the Lords, and his voice stopped mid-sentence. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He did not address Isabel. He did not look at her. He simply appeared at Rosalind's side, took her hand, and tucked it into the crook of his arm. "I find this party tedious," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly. "Walk with me." He led her to the terrace. The night air was cool and smelled of jasmine from the Pembertons' garden. Behind them, through the glass doors, they could see the bright, glittering theater of the party continuing without them. "I'm sorry," he said. "You have nothing to apologize for. I brought you into this world. I should have." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I should have protected you better. You cannot protect me from people's nature, Edmund. Nor would I want you to. I did not marry you to be sheltered. I married you to be your partner." He turned to face her. In the moonlight, his severity had dissolved into something raw and open. "I married you for the wrong reasons," he said. "I married you because it was convenient and efficient and logical. And every day since, you have made me understand how little those things matter." He took both her hands in his. "You told me my house had no soul." "You were wrong. It was not the house. It was me. And you brought it back." She felt tears burn behind her eyes. She would not let them fall. "Not here, not now. We are hosting the Thornfield Ball in a fortnight," he said. "You will not hide. You will stand beside me. and I will make certain that every person in that room knows exactly what you mean to me." The night of the ball, Thornfield House blazed like a lantern. Thousands of candles burned in the crystal chandeliers. The ballroom was banked with white roses and trailing ivy, their scent mingling with beeswax and the warm hum of 300 voices. The orchestra tuned in the gallery. Jewels flashed. Silks rustled. The entire ton had come. Isabel Crane arrived in crimson, her diamonds glittering, her smile sharp as a blade. She positioned herself at the center of the room, surrounded by her circle, radiating a confidence she no longer entirely felt. The announcement came. The Marquess and Marchioness of Thornfield. Rosalind descended the staircase on Edmund's arm. She wore a gown of pale gold silk, the same color as sunlight through honey, cut with devastating simplicity. No diamonds, no tiara. A single strand of amber beads at her throat, warm against her skin. Her dark hair was pinned in a low, loose knot. She looked like what she was, a woman who had never needed ornament because she had always carried her worth inside her. Edmund stopped at the foot of the stairs. He turned to the room. 300 faces turned toward him. "Before we begin," he said, his voice quiet but absolute, the kind of voice that does not need volume because it carries authority in every syllable. "I wish to say something to my wife." The room went still. "Rosalind." He turned to face her, taking her hands. "I brought you into a house without a heart and asked you to live there. You did not complain. You did not demand. You simply began, quietly and stubbornly, to make it a home. You planted snowdrops on my dining table. You filled my library with conversation. You brought warmth into rooms that had been cold for years." His voice roughened. "I married you for duty. I stand before you now because of love. A love I did not seek, did not expect, and do not deserve. But it is yours entirely if you will have it." The silence was total. 300 people held their breath. Rosalind looked up at him. The tears she had held back on the terrace fell now. 2 of them, tracing slow lines down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. "I have always had it, Edmund," she said softly. "I was only waiting for you to know." He raised her hand to his lips. Then he turned to the orchestra and nodded once. The waltz began. The floor cleared. They danced alone in a circle of golden light, his arm around her waist, her hand on his shoulder, their eyes never leaving each other. They moved together as if they had been dancing all their lives, as if the months of silence and formality and careful distance had simply been a long, complicated prelude to this single, perfect moment. Across the room, Lady Isabel Crane stood motionless, her crimson gown suddenly garish, her diamonds suddenly cold. The Marquess had not looked at her once. Her weapon, gossip, required an audience willing to listen, and the audience had been stolen from her by a man standing in front of 300 people and choosing, publicly and irrevocably, the quiet woman in the gold dress. Isabel's mouth tightened. Then, without a word, she turned and left the ballroom. No one noticed her go. Autumn came to Thornfield in shades of amber and bronze. The formal gardens were changing under Rosalind's hand. The rigid geometric beds remained, but they were softened now with meadow sage and wild thyme, with tangles of clematis climbing the old stone walls. A kitchen garden had been established behind the south wing, and Rosalind could be found there most mornings, her hands in the soil, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face from the sun. Edmund had taken to joining her. He would appear with 2 cups of tea, set one on the garden wall, and crouch beside her to examine whatever she was planting. He had opinions about compost now. He had developed strong feelings about drainage. The servants, who had spent years navigating the silent, precise corridors of a house run like a military campaign, were quietly astonished. The small round dining table had acquired a permanent vase of whatever was in season. Roses in summer, chrysanthemums in autumn, holly and ivy in winter. The library, once a place of solitary, silent study, now had 2 chairs pulled close to the fire, with a small table between them for tea. In the evenings they sat there together, reading or talking, their conversation moving easily between books and gardens and the business of the estate. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, and the silence was not empty but full, a shared space that belonged to both of them. On a morning in late October, Rosalind was sitting on the stone bench by the south wall, watching the last of the roses nod in the breeze. Edmund came across the lawn toward her, his coat slung over his arm, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had been helping the new head gardener stake the young apple trees in the orchard. There was dirt on his hands and a leaf in his hair. He sat beside her and took her hand. "The Damascena is thriving," he said, nodding toward a robust bush laden with deep pink blooms. "I told you it would. The south wall gets the best light." He turned her hand over in his, tracing her fingers with his thumb. "I love you, Rosalind," he said, as simply as if he were stating the weather. "I think I loved you from the moment you stood in my library in a muddy dress and told me my house had no soul." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "It was your soul I was worried about," she said. "The house was just a symptom." He kissed the top of her head. "And now, both are recovering nicely." He laughed. It was a sound she had heard only a handful of times, low and warm and slightly rusty from disuse. And each time it felt like discovering a room in a house she had thought she knew completely. She took his hand and pressed it gently, briefly against her stomach. He went very still. "Rosalind." "Spring," she said. "The doctor confirmed it this morning." He looked at her. The green eyes, usually so guarded, so carefully controlled, were wide and undefended, and in them she saw something she had never seen before. Not the severity, not the calculation, not the cool, armored self-possession that had defined him since the day they met. She saw joy, pure, unguarded, terrified joy. He pulled her close and held her, his face pressed against her hair, and he did not speak for a long time, because there were no words precise enough for what he felt. She held him back, this man who had come to her father's failing house looking for a practical solution and found instead something he had never thought to look for. She thought of the girl she had been, kneeling in a muddy garden in a brown dress, her hands red with cold, her future a narrowing corridor of debt and decline. She thought of the woman she was now, sitting in the autumn sun with her husband's arms around her, and a new life growing quietly inside her. It was not a bargain. It was not a transaction. It was a life built from small, stubborn acts of love, snowdrops on a table, a cup of tea carried through a dark house, a rose planted against a south-facing wall, and the patient, unshakable belief that even the coldest house, even the most guarded heart, could learn to bloom again. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what part of the story touched you the most.